All right. I wish I had a bunch of wonderful things to tell you, and I probably do have all kinds of amazing things. But let me just stick with this. We have so many things that are going to be happening over the course of Advent, and I hope you will put them or some of them on your calendars. First Sunday of Advent, the United Women of Faith, which still sounds weird when I say it, are hosting an event here. There's going to be an advertisement about that in the Bulletin Sunday, but it's going to be, I think, hot cocoa and like cookies and cakes and stuff like that. So it should be a good opportunity for fellowship, and I hope you'll come. Our what we now call our worship arts department is in the process of putting together a play that will run on the 16th and 17th of December. It's going to be like a dinner theater here in the Ministry Center. Shay is leading that up with the help of some other people, Sharon and Debbie in particular. And so it should be a pretty good time. They're already working on it. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be really fun. They'll run the same thing, each of those 2 nights. So there'll be more information about that as well. And then that Sunday, the 18th of December, we're going to have one service that Sunday because the Ministry Center will still be set up for the play that happened late the night before. So we'll have one service over in the chapel at 10:30, and then that afternoon we'll have the children's Christmas program, and I believe that's also going to be in the chapel, if I understand that right. Christmas Eve, we will have one service on Christmas Eve, and then we will also have one service on Christmas Day, on Christmas Sunday morning, for anybody who chooses to come back. So you're more than welcome to come to either of those or both of them. But I think it's going to be a good holiday season for us, and I, for one, am excited about it. When you see Debbie Schultz, stop for a minute and tell her thank you. Her official title in the church is the Executive Director of Family Ministries, but you need to think of her kind of like, if this were another organization, she would be the Chief Operating Officer. She does, and I mean literally, she does everything. That's not just a statement. When it comes to operations, she's in charge of a lot. One of the things she's been doing is coordinating the meals on Wednesday nights. So if you're having a chance to come and participate in that, those meals this year, we've gotten a lot of really good feedback about them. I have really enjoyed them myself. They've been really good, and I've enjoyed the fellowship. But she has a number of people who report to her. For instance, Olivia, our director of, right now, Children and Youth Ministries, reports to her. The director of the Child Care Center reports to her. She is in the process of starting to work with our homeless outreach. She's going to kind of be the coordinator for that from the church's perspective. Of course, that's transitioning into the purview of the nonprofit that we have founded. But all of that is to say she has a lot of irons and a lot of different fires, but she does a lot that isn't seen. You know that our financial position at the church has just been very difficult throughout the course of the pandemic. About 6 years ago, when I got here and took a look at the financial history of the church, I made a prediction that our charitable giving would probably continue to decrease and we would need to take a look at additional sources of revenue if we were going to survive. I wish I could have made a prediction about the pandemic. Nonetheless, I had a good leadership team that listened, and that's been true. With the demographic shift in this area, we live in the most diverse 5-mile radius in the Oklahoma City metro area, which is awesome. The demographic shift in this area, I thought, would probably result in a continued decline in the charitable giving part of our revenue, and that's proven true. And so we took some steps with Debbie at the helm and a bunch of volunteers to find an alternative source of revenue. When I got here, we had a Mother's Day Out program. Anybody have any idea what our enrollment was in that at the time? Probably not. Some of you might know. It was right around 35, 36 kids. And we were hoping each year to be able to bring in about $10,000 from that program, okay? We took a look at that and said this is probably the best opportunity we have to not just increase revenue, but to do it in a way that fits in with the mission of our church, which in this case helps to provide quality childcare to the community. So while our charitable giving, as predicted, has declined. Not as much. I was wrong about that. I thought it would decline more and more rapidly than it has, but it has declined. We went from our overall, that program, we wanted about $10,000 from it a year, but overall, total revenue from that program, it was bringing in just under $25,000 a year. We have brought in $700,000, just under $700,000 so far this year from the Child Care Center, and it looks like we'll have somewhere between $125,000 and $150,000 in revenue over expenses from the Child Care Center this year, which has put us at, for the first time in the history of Southern Hills, where it looks like our total revenue for the church this year will be over $1 million. Now, as you can imagine, as programs increase, so does cost, right? So our cost has gone up. But this time last year and throughout the pandemic, we were struggling to pay anything. And that included trying to figure out how to make payroll. If you've been to any of the meetings of the members, you've heard a lot of this. The reason I'm saying this is that while I'm not going to say we're in a good financial position, we're in a much better financial position than we were in a year ago, and we're starting to make some ground back. And that speaks to the hard work and the generosity of an awful lot of people in this church who've done a lot of work. But one of those people is Debbie. She has found this year alone, with the $29,000 grant that she's applied for that's coming in December, late November, December, I believe she will have brought in about $150,000 in grant funding alone this year through what she has applied for. She found the CACFP program, which is our federal food reimbursement program, that's different than what we started before the pandemic, and we bring in about $75,000 a year from that program alone to help recoup the cost of paying for food. So she just does a phenomenal job. She does an amazing job, and the amount of work that goes into that is tremendous. DHS just revamped their STARS rating system. They used to have up to 3 stars, and they created a new system that goes up to 5 stars. Why does that matter? Well, in addition to marketability for the program, the higher your star rating, the more DHS will compensate you for the children that DHS is supporting in your program. Debbie and her team are now having to do, when I say a significant amount of work, I mean that, to comply, but they just got a 5-star rating and they're living into that. And that as well is going to bring in more to that program. So stop her at some point and let her know how much she is appreciated. I'm sure you can imagine how much it means to hear something like that from the members of the congregation, and she really is doing an amazing job. So don't tell her I said that, just do it, if you don't mind. All right, so we're in Genesis. Today we're in chapter 32, which includes probably one of the best known and really most difficult to understand stories in, well, let's say this part of Genesis. Jacob is going to wrestle with God, and it's such a random occurrence that it's really difficult to figure out why it's in there, other than that this is the moment when Jacob's name changes to Israel, right? And I hope that in our conversations about the way God is referred to, and throughout Genesis, and about God's revelation of God's self to Jacob already, that Yahweh is El, according to how they understood the world at the time, then the name Israel should mean something to you. That literally means to wrestle with El, the one who wrestled with El. So we're going to get to that, and I'm going to fill in some blanks and tell you a little bit about that story that you may not know, because it is an old story, as many of them are, that has an older origination even than its inclusion in the book of Genesis, and is kind of retold in Genesis. So we'll get there. We're also going to take a look at how and why Jacob feels bad for what he did to Esau. When we read through this today, it's going to look like he is trying to bribe his brother, but that's most likely not what is going to happen. So let's go ahead and dig into this. Scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. So let's do that. Gracious and giving God, we're grateful for the opportunity to study today, to learn more about who you are and who you're calling us to be. And we're grateful for the story of the scriptures that is left behind so that we can better understand you and your character by reading about what you have already done amongst your people. We pray that as a result of that and our time together, that you would help us to know you better and that you would help to strengthen our fellowship with one another. We pray for those this morning who are unable to be here, particularly those who are struggling with health concerns. We pray that you would hold them in the palm of your hand. And this we ask in your holy name. Amen. Chapter 32. Jacob went on his way, and God's messengers approached him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp," and he named that sacred place Mahanaim. Okay, so this is one of those things that you just read right over, right? In fact, the first couple of times I ever read this, I just read right over, because why on earth did God's messengers approach him? The word for messenger is malak or malakaim is the full way to say that in Hebrew. Malak Elohim would be God's angels or God's messengers, and that is actually what is written here. It's Malak Elohim. But if you'll remember, Elohim is plural, right? And so when you read that in Hebrew, what you get is the messengers of the gods approached Jacob. Why does that get translated again as singular? Again, for as we've talked about this in the past, trying to explain the plurality of their view about what at the time was a Canaanite pantheon is a really difficult prospect for particularly those of us today who have believed that our faith tradition was always monotheistic. And if you're willing to accept that those things evolve over time, that's not a big deal. But a lot of us kind of struggle with understanding that the history of our faith is a little bit different than we thought. So the translation of that changes a little bit over time and is not completely accurate, which is one of the reasons to study it in its original text. So what you get is the messengers of the gods approached him. And approached is also interesting. The word for that is pagabe, which is a word that is used to approach violently. And so what you get is, literally, when you read that in Hebrew, it says the messengers of the gods attacked Jacob. My suspicion is that it's not translated that way. No, let me back up. When I say suspicion, there's a lot written about this, but most of it comes down to nobody has any idea what on earth that has why that is in there is beyond anybody's understanding, save for the fact that there are other instances in which people are approached by Malakim or Malak Elohim, and so it kind of tends to in some way coincide with traveling or leaving, but there's not much written in any ancient texts that makes it easy to try to interpret why on earth that is. So it must have been some kind of ancient tradition that powerful people were approached by supernatural beings when they traveled. That's really very difficult to interpret. Nonetheless, it is there. So when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." He could have called that Beth El. There's really not a good reason for why he named it Mahanaim, which means two camps, two different camps, except that he's about to split his group into two camps, so maybe it's foreshadowing. Jacob sent messengers. Okay, the word there is the same. So when you see angel or messenger, it is the same word in Hebrew. It's going to be malakaim, right? And short is malak, or malakaim, is going to be the word for messenger. So there was no difference in how a messenger was referred to. The angels, what we translate as angels, same word in Hebrew, are supernatural beings or divine messengers. But when you read it in Hebrew, it's just these messengers have given their fealty to this particular leader. So in this case, these are Jacob's messengers. He sent them ahead of him to his brother Esau toward the land of Seir and the open country of Edom. He gave them these orders. "Say this to my master Esau." Now he is being subservient. And as we read through this first part of the text, we're going to find that he is going to try to send all of these gifts to Esau, and he's also going to essentially hide at the back of his encampment. And it makes him look like a coward, But I don't think that's what's going on. Let's get into it. This is the message of your servant Jacob. I've lived as an immigrant with Laban, where I've stayed until now. In Hebrew, that's 4 words. He summarizes the last 20 years in 4 words. And really, all it says in Hebrew is, I have been detained up to this point. Gets translated a little bit longer here. I own cattle, donkeys, flocks, men servants, and women servants. Is that translated as plural in your Bible? Cattle, donkeys, flocks, men servants, women. It probably is plural, right? Most translators translate it as plural. I was just reading about this recently because one of the translators, a lot of commentators will do their own translation in the midst of their commentary, and this commentator said the same thing. I've translated this as plural, when in reality, in Hebrew it's singular. All of those things are singular. I have a cow, a donkey, sheep. I have a servant, man, and then 2 words for servant, male and female servant. There's a lot written about why that is the case. First off, why is it translated as a plurality in your English translation? So that it will be more accurate. Why does he not say that in the plural in Hebrew when there very clearly is a way that he could do that? Most likely, a lot of scholars say that it's probably an attempt to not completely tip his hat or show his hand to Esau because he's worried. So he's trying not to give him an indication of how many of these things he has. But that's really the only explanation for why that is. I hope you're getting to this point that, as we've talked about, there are mistranslations, right? Going from the ancient Hebrew or the Greek of the New Testament into English. There are a lot of them in this passage. A lot of them. All right, let's keep going. I'm sending this message to my master now to ask that he be kind. Verse 6, the messengers, Malachim, returned to Jacob and said, we went to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you with 400 men. Jacob was terrified and felt trapped. I would explain that, but I don't need to because the Bible did. That's exact. Jacob hears this, that he's coming with 400 people, and he thinks he's coming to attack him. So he divided the people with him, and the flocks, the cattle, and the camels into 2 camps. So probably Mahanaim is a foreshadowing of this, into 2 camps. Verse 8, he thought, if Esau meets the first camp and attacks it, at least 1 camp will be left to escape. I'm going to go ahead and tell you this because it affects this chapter, although it's really a little bit of a tangent. It's probably irrelevant. You probably won't care. But when you read this in Hebrew, if you do any study on your own, if you have like a Hebrew interlinear, or I have a book in my office that gives the Hebrew version of the Bible with the English underneath it, translated as accurately as it can be. What you're going to find is this. The actual Jewish Bible, the Old Covenant, in Hebrew, doesn't match up with your verse numbers here. So for instance, the chapter 31 goes all the way into chapter 32 in the English Bible. 31 of the Hebrew Bible goes into 32 of the English Bible. So the verse structure is strange. For instance, verses 1 and 2 in the Hebrew Bible in chapter 32 are chapter 31, verses 55 and 56 in the Hebrew Bible. Why does that matter? It probably doesn't, but if you're doing that kind of study or you're taking a look at a Bible that has the Hebrew and then the English next to it, know that the verse structure doesn't match up entirely, so you'll have to find where you're supposed to be and compare it to where you are. Okay, let me go back, get off a tangent. Verse 8, he thought if Esau meets the first camp and attacks it, at least 1 camp will be left to escape. That's fair. Jacob said, Lord, God of my father Abraham. Now remember, Lord is Yahweh, God is El, or Eloah. Jacob said, Lord, the supreme God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, who said to me, go back to your country and to your relatives, and I'll make sure that things go well for you. I don't deserve how loyal and truthful you've been to your servant. Did you catch that? So he is invoking God and God's promise. He's followed faithfully what God has said. But it's also been 20 years since he arrived at Laban's home, not to mention the length of the journey from his home to Laban's home. He's been gone a long time. To quote my favorite version of Robin Hood from when I was a child. You have to allow that years of war and distance can change a person. What you're about to see is that he feels bad about what he did to Esau. He feels bad about it. There's an indication here that perhaps the only reason he did that to Esau was because he was told to and because it was God's will, but he feels bad about this. And so the gifts that he's about to give, he's not offering as a bribe so much as he is essentially saying, what I have should have been yours. Now, Esau is already more powerful than Jacob is, but Jacob feels bad about what he did and is essentially saying the things I have should have been the things that you have, so you're welcome to them if you want them. And he's staying at the back and giving gifts first. He is afraid. He does think that Esau may attack him, but he is trying to, in all of his language in this is the language of humility. He is making himself subservient, and he's going to sit there, and if Esau attacks him, he's going to take it. He's not going to try to fight back. So, in everything he's doing, it is essentially his attempt at making recompense, because in the intervening 20 years, he's obviously changed as a person. Feels bad about what he did. Okay, I don't deserve how loyal and truthful you've been to your servant. I went away across the Jordan with just my staff, but now I've become two camps. Verse 11, save me from my brother Esau. I'm afraid that he'll come and kill me, the mothers and their children. You are the one who told me, I'll make sure things go well for you, and I'll make your descendants like the sand of the sea, so many that you won't be able to count them. Now again, he does say, save me and the mothers and their children. When you read it in Hebrew, though, it gives more of a sense of he's concerned about the people that are there with him more so than he is concerned about himself, which makes a bit of a difference. Verse 13, Jacob spent that night there. From what he had acquired, he set aside a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 nursing camels with their young, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. He separated these herds and gave them to his servants. He said to them, now this is all happening at night, mind you. Go ahead of me and put some distance between each of the herds. He ordered the first group, when my brother Esau meets you and asks you, who are you with, where are you going, and whose herds are these in front of you, say, they are your servant Jacob's. Again, language of humility. A gift sent to my master Esau, language of humility. And Jacob is actually right behind us. He also ordered the second group, the third group, and everybody following the herds, say exactly the same thing to Esau when you find him. All of this is happening at night. Say also, your servant Jacob is right behind us. Jacob thought, I may be able to pacify Esau with the gift I'm sending ahead. When I meet him, perhaps he'll be kind. So Jacob sent the gift ahead of him, but he spent the night in the camp. All right, so we're gonna divert here for a second and enter into this other story before we go back to the saga between Jacob and Esau. Jacob, again, is trying to make amends in the way that he can, and also in a way that fits with his culture. We're going to step into this other story. So there's a play on words here because Jabak or Yabak and Jacob and wrestle, which is Yarek, they all are almost identical words in Hebrew. So there's an intentional play on words that's happening here. Jacob is going to wrestle with a man. A couple of things that are important to know. The idea that a supernatural being appears looking like a human it happens all throughout the Old Testament in general, and that the people who are present are not aware that what they're seeing is a supernatural being and not a human until the supernatural being reveals that is the case. That's a common theme, both in the scriptures but also in antiquity. So the fact that Jacob doesn't know whom it is he is wrestling with until the being reveals itself is not a strange thing. Why does Jacob wrestle with him in the first place? Why does the being which reveals itself to be God want to leave before sunrise as the sun is coming up? Those are all great questions and difficult to interpret. So let's start with, why is he wrestling him in the first place, and why is it that he wants to leave at dawn? There's an old story that follows this pattern from Ur, much older than this story. And it talks about Jacob traveling across the river here. This river, I always want to say Jacob. The Jabbok River is a river that flows several hundred miles and cuts a swath of deep canyons. It's a very old river. And so crossing it is a formidable thing to do, even though the river itself is apparently very shallow, so it's easy to ford when you walk across it, but the canyons are typically very deep. And so part of what may be happening here is that Jacob is intentionally putting a canyon between himself and Esau, right? But the way this is written, it almost looks like he crosses back and forth over it like several times. So you're talking about an easy crossing of the river, a difficult crossing of the canyon in which the river resides. In this story, the old one, Jacob is wrestling a river demon that loses its power when the sun comes up. And so what you end up seeing here is sort of a version of this very old story, but kind of retold from a Hebrew perspective. Remember, these are Hebrew writers, and we see that in other ways throughout Genesis. The idea that the surrounding cultures, right, particularly, we've talked a lot about the Canaanites and the Canaanite pantheon. The surrounding cultures, according to the Hebrew text here, they trace their origins to the same people. They're related. Culturally, they're related, which means that it shouldn't be a stretch for us to understand that they share a belief system, right? Even if they have some different beliefs about that belief system, the origination of their spiritual life comes from the same place. Each of the cultures evolves with that a little bit over time, but essentially it has the same origin. So what you see here in a lot of Genesis is the Hebrew people taking a story of spirituality that is common to them and their cultural relatives and saying, we would say, this is your version of it. They would say, this is the real version of it. So you're getting this old story retold from a Hebrew perspective. So it's not a river demon. It is actually God revealing, again, God's self to Jacob. Does that matter for our purposes? Only in knowing that the story is older. This portion of the story is older than what is actually included in the text. It is retold, and it gives an origination for a couple of things. One is the practice of not eating that particular tendon in Hebrew culture. This is why they don't do that. And the other is where did the name Israel come from? Why is, by the time this story is being written and told, Israel is a well-known name. So you're getting an origination story for where the name Israel, which in Hebrew means to wrestle with El, comes from. Why are we called this? Well, we're called this because Jacob wasn't actually wrestling a river demon. The being that was there revealed itself again to Jacob, which happened just a few chapters before, as El. Lo and behold, this is El. So what does Jacob want? Jacob wants a blessing. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. We also see that Jacob is wrestling El. The being reveals itself to be El, which is Yahweh, right? We've already made that connection. So why is Jacob winning? If this is the supreme God, El Shaddai, the God who is the supreme, most powerful God, if this is the most powerful God, why is God having so much trouble wrestling Jacob? What we're supposed to connect here, and what would have been well known at the time, is that Jacob is weirdly supernaturally strong. We get that same story is told when he moves this gigantic stone out of the way when he first arrives in Laban's country. So the belief about Jacob is that he's just weirdly like supernaturally strong. So he's wrestling with God. He has wrestled against, we're going to see this in a minute, but his blessing is you're going to be called Israel because you have wrestled against God and against men, and you have prevailed in those places. So the name itself is a blessing, and the name is a change. Most likely, Jacob wants a blessing that will allow him to protect his family against Esau if Esau is angry, even though and what we're seeing here in a weird twist is that he could probably do it himself because, again, he is weirdly supernaturally strong. So Jacob, who is strong enough to wrestle God, is not going to attack his brother Esau, which is another indicator that he's trying to approach this with humility because he feels bad about what he robbed Esau of. So there's a lot in this story that I would say is difficult to translate. 29:10 is the passage, if you want to look at it, where we see Jacob's strength indicated. Okay, there's a whole nother thing here, and I'm gonna tell you what it is, in spite of the fact that I have no desire to just be gross. But the word here, so he touches. Well, let me get us there. Let's start with the story. Verse 22, Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them cross the river. But Jacob stayed apart by himself, and a man wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the man saw that he couldn't defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. Okay. This has, one of the interpretations of this is that what we're looking at here is a sexual encounter. And part of that is because of the idea that a man wrestled with Jacob all night and the interpretation of the grabbing of the thigh. One of those is accurate, the other is not. The word that is used for wrestle here is different than the word that is used for embrace. The word that is used for embrace is actually used when he and Esau will embrace in a minute. The word that is used as wrestled here is a violent word. So they're together, but they're together in a very violent way. But the second part of that with the thigh, the word that is used there is yarika, gets translated to thigh, because that is more palatable than scrotum, which is what it actually means. The word there actually translates to the word scrotum. But it is similar. Hebrew is a really difficult language to understand. So the way that it is written, in every other instance, it is used that way. It's translated that way. But the word for thigh is very similar to that word. So translators translate it to thigh, and fits pretty well with the story. Why does that matter? Because if you read about this in commentaries, you're going to read an interpretation of this, that what you're talking about here is a sexual encounter between Jacob and this man or supernatural being. Most likely, that's not the case. I think that the versions, the commentaries that talk about that are just kind of doing some poor scholarship. I really think that what is happening here, most likely, remember when we were talking about the fact that Abraham had somebody put his hand under his thigh, and what you're talking about there is a blessing for future generations. You're not talking about something sexual here. The word used for grabbed is like violent there. It's like struck. So you're talking about a fight here, and the striking of Jacob in that region caused a tendon to break. That I think is the valid interpretation of what's happening here. You're also getting, again, a reinterpretation of a much older story. This was originally a river demon. No, it's not a river demon. This is how it happened. This is what really happened, and this is why, actually, our name is what it is. We're called Israel because of this. This is our story, right? So you're getting a little bit of the reinterpretation there. So why dawn? If this isn't a river demon, then why was dawn an issue? There was a belief in ancient Israel that the period of twilight, in the morning in particular, was a time when holiness and unholiness came together, and it was considered something to be negative. So that's one belief. The Celts refer to that time of day as a thin time, and a lot of cultures kind of have a similar belief about twilight, both morning and evening twilight. So that could be one of the things that's going on there. The other is that it could be possible that God, Yahweh, El, knows that in the daylight Jacob will see God, and as we have learned, or as is mentioned in the scriptures, no one can see the face of God and live. So he may know that the only reason that Jacob is not dying because of seeing God is because it's too dark for him to see God, and if the sun comes up, he'll see God and he won't be able to survive that. Those are two interpretations of that. Probably both of them are valid, but they're all extrapolations from the story itself because we don't get any explanation there. Let me finish it with you. Let me go back to verse 25. When the man saw that he could not defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. The man said, "Let me go, because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." So Jacob is clinging to God, asking for a blessing, right? Where are we? Okay, verse 27. He said to Jacob, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer." Now, God is not asking Jacob what his name is because he doesn't know. This is a segue. It is an entrance into the way he is going to bless him, which is with a name change, okay? Verse 28, then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel," which is pronounced Israel, right? Because you struggled with God and with men and won, which is the definition of that word. Verse 29, Jacob, who's not actually Jacob anymore, also asked and said, "Tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask for my name?" And he blessed Jacob there. And Jacob named the place you see it here too? Peniel, or you'll see it pronounced as Penuel, right? Which means the face of El, face of God. Because I have seen God face to face and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed Penuel limping because of his thigh. So the sun is coming up and El is gone. Therefore, Israelites don't eat the tendon attached to the thigh muscle to this day because he grabbed Jacob's thigh muscle at the tendon. That gives us, again, a little bit of an origination story. Why don't they eat this tendon? Here's why they don't eat this tendon. Here's also why we are called the Israelites. That's where the name came from, comes from this story, which is not actually about a river demon. It was Jacob wrestling God. And we have the knowledge of that because we are the descendants of Jacob, which is why our story, I don't mean us, but the Israelites would say, we have the knowledge of this because we're descended from Jacob, and this is a story that was passed down to us. Interesting passage for sure, and a lot there to consider. So with the time we have left, if you have thoughts or questions, I'd love to take a look at those. What struck you from this chapter? No pun intended. Have you ever read through the story of Jacob wrestling with God and kind of wondered, like, why is this even here? You know? Yeah. Right. It is a strange thing. And then God touches him, you know, and all of a sudden something breaks. Like he could have done that at any time. I think what you're getting, this is just my take on it, because I think it's hard to interpret as well. Although it does fall into a genre of literature that is kind of part and parcel for what we would call origination mythologies, mythologies that explain the names of things or why things are done. You know, the Cherokee Nation has this story about a spider descending down to get fire, and the reason that the Black Widow's back is red is because it got singed in the fire that it was trying to get, that kind of thing. You know, here's how this happened sort of story. That's the answer. I think it is, again, this one's really difficult to interpret. And the background information helps a little. I can wrap my mind around, okay, this is an older story, and this is a Hebraic or Israelite retelling of the story. I can get that. But there's also a little bit here that speaks to the realm of origination myth, I think, as well. So. All right, y'all are going to be easy on me today. No questions this time? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Never mind. Be hard. Peniel or Penuel. In 30, can you tell me where you are? 30 and 31. The verses? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I wasn't, okay. Yeah. So 30, place Peniel, and then 31, the sun rose as Jacob passed Penuel. Uh-huh. Nope, same thing, same name, same place. Evolution of language is the best answer. The way to say this, a face of God is Peniel, But here's how I can explain this. You have Miami, Florida, but how do you say it in Oklahoma? How do you pronounce the place Miami in Oklahoma? Even though it really should be pronounced Miami, right? Same thing here. So you're just getting a dialectic change in how the place name was pronounced. Does that make sense? I wish I had a more exciting answer for you, but that's what happened there. Yeah, when we moved, I was born here, but I moved away as a kid, and so when I moved back to Oklahoma, I made the mistake of pronouncing Miami incorrectly, and I was very quickly corrected about that. Durant is another one. That one just gets me to no end because I lived there, and everybody outside of Durant wants to put an emphasis on the first syllable and call it Durant. But I lived there, and they don't call it Durant. They actually pronounce it like D-E-R. So everybody there says Durant instead of Durant. And same thing. Yeah. We're just strange, and none of us are probably pronouncing anything correctly anyway. All right, any other thoughts, questions? Yes. Right. Okay. All right, so this is a good statement. So one of the question for those of you who are watching kind of has to do with what do we learn from this? Like, what do we pull out of this? So let me transition, put on a different hat. One of the things we talk about is that in the study we're teaching, we're learning about things that help us to better interpret the text. But if I were going to preach about this, then I'm looking for the messages that can be pulled out that we can connect to our faith journey in our daily lives. So I'm going to put that hat on and preach about this, which I won't do. Here are the succinct messages I would pull out. One is, it is all right to wrestle with God, i.e. it is all right to wrestle with your faith, your belief system. It's all right to wrestle with what you believe God is telling you to do. God is big enough to handle that and also allows it, right? So one of the themes, and I would develop this into a sermon, is it is all right to struggle with God, i.e. it is all right to struggle with what you believe. It's all right to struggle with what you believe you're being told or asked to do. It's all right to struggle with what you think is or isn't right or okay. All of those things are okay struggles to have. The second theme, if I were going to preach a different sermon about it, would be that you don't come out of an encounter with God unchanged. You're going to be transformed through your encounter with God, no matter how that happens. Does that make sense? So I think there are several lessons that you can pull out of this. Does God offer the opportunity for choice? I think that, yeah, and if I were going to preach about that, I would kind of probably approach that from a God isn't a dictator kind of approach. God allows you to participate in that relationship, even if that participation looks like a struggle or causes a struggle or causes some pain in your life as you're growing. Encountering God as you transform, and I would use the name change to talk about the transformation, as you transform in your encounter with God, there is likely going to be some pain in parts of your life where things change, and I would use the pain caused to Jacob as an example of that. Then I would have to qualify that because people would say, were you saying God is going to intentionally hurt me? And I would say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I don't think theologically that's accurate. I think that the lesson that you get out of that is that most of the time, change, which is very possible, is in some way painful, even if that pain is a result of disrupting our status quo, breaking us outside of our boxes of normal behavior or changing habits, which can be a hard thing to do. So those would be kind of the directions that I would try to pull some meaning out of that. I think, though, that those are good lessons just out of that passage. Probably would just completely not say anything about the accurate translation of thigh, because that would just throw everybody for a loop, and half of the parents in the room would be angry with me. So probably wouldn't say that at all. All right, friends, we're about 10 minutes early. Other thoughts? Don't tell anybody. I'll get in trouble if anybody finds out that I'm getting you out early on a regular basis. All right, let me pray for you. Thanks for being here. God, we're grateful for today and for the opportunity to learn more about who you are and who you are calling us to be. We're grateful for the opportunity to better understand your character as we learn the history of your interaction with your people. We pray, God, that as we learn, that what we learn would be internalized and would transform us, so that as a result of our time with you and our dialogue with you, we might be a transformed people who participate in your transformation of the world. This we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you, friends, for coming.